done too much damage. Now time is fighting you. The organism of time is dying. You are its wound.
We have to stop it, even if it kills us.
The rift is not the end, it's just the beginning.
If we don't save time, it will destroy us all.
The year 4098 began as humanity's darkest hour. Climate disasters ravaged continents, economies crumbled under the weight of endless wars over dwindling resources, and the collective hope of billions flickered like a dying candle. It was as though the world teetered on the edge of something inevitable, a final collapse that would extinguish the species entirely. Then the rifts appeared. The first was over the Pacific Ocean, a shimmering distortion in the sky that bent light in impossible ways. At first, it looked like an atmospheric anomaly, an aurora or a freak weather event, but within hours, similar rifts began to open across the globe. Cities that had barely recovered from political unrest or natural catastrophes now faced this new, unexplainable phenomenon. Panic rippled through the population as reports flooded in. Shimmering fissures hovering above cities, deep within forests, and even beneath the oceans, each radiating a low, gut-churning hum that seemed to vibrate through every living cell. The first eyewitness accounts came from fishermen near the Pacific Rift. They described shapes emerging from the distortion, impossible forms that seemed to collapse in and out of existence. One man, trembling with fear, claimed the creatures weren't moving but rather shifting, as if they were being translated into a language the human brain couldn't understand. The word spread quickly. Aliens, a concept humanity had once dreamed about, debated, and fictionalized, was suddenly real. But these beings weren't here to inspire wonder. They brought terror. Within hours, the beings were seen near other rifts, though their appearances were inconsistent. Some described them as towering, angular structures that warped light around them, like prisms gone mad. Others claimed they were fluid and organic, their surfaces glistening like wet ink, folding into themselves as if rejecting three-dimensional space. No two reports were identical, and this inconsistency bred chaos. Military forces scrambled to respond, though their weapons were useless. Bullets dissolved into thin air before reaching the rifts, and missiles detonated prematurely as though time itself rejected their trajectories. The first true encounter came in Brazil, where a group of scientists studying a rift in the Amazon reported hearing an audible tone, like a low-frequency vibration. It wasn't a sound they heard with their ears, but one they felt deep within their skulls. The team leader, Dr. Rosalia Peralta, described the sensation in her final recorded log before vanishing without a trace. It's like they're speaking, but not to us, to something deeper. My thoughts, they're not mine anymore. The tone was a warning. The beings began to speak in pulses, vibrations that bypassed language entirely and planted raw meaning into the human mind. The message was clear, simple, and terrifying. You have misunderstood the nature of time. You live a lie. This lie will destroy you. Dr. Aylin Kovacs was in her lab at the European Temporal Research Institute when the first reports of the rifts reached her. As one of the leading physicists specializing in the study of temporal anomalies, she had spent her life chasing the elusive truth of time's structure. Yet even her years of study had left her ill-prepared for what was unfolding. The message from the beings, combined with the sudden failure of global timekeeping systems, sent her mind reeling. Atomic clocks stopped, GPS systems failed, even biological rhythms were disrupted, with people reporting flashes of memories that felt more like premonitions than recollections. Within days, the United Nations formed a task force to investigate the phenomenon, pulling experts from every field. Aylin was one of the first recruits, joining a team that included Dr. Imran Shafiq, a biologist with extensive experience studying extremophiles, and Emily Vance, a controversial philosopher whose theories on time as a human construct had long been dismissed by the scientific community. The team was sent to the epicenter of the largest rift, located in Antarctica, where temporal readings were spiking beyond anything previously recorded. The journey to the Antarctic base was harrowing. The closer they got to the rift, the more the environment seemed to twist around them. Instruments malfunctioned, timepieces spun erratically, and shadows stretched unnaturally, moving independently of their sources. By the time the team arrived at the base, they were already feeling the effects on their own bodies. Aylin experienced sudden disjointed memories of events that hadn't yet occurred. Emily described a growing sense of detachment from her own body, as though she were watching herself from a distance. Imran's physiological readings showed his heart rate fluctuating wildly, his blood pressure spiking and dropping in erratic patterns. The rift itself was massive, a pulsating tear in reality that towered over the frozen landscape. It hummed with an otherworldly rhythm that seemed to sync with the team's heartbeats, a sensation both intimate and invasive. The air around it felt alive, charged with an energy that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. Standing before it, they felt like ants staring up at a god. The beings began to emerge again, their forms more distinct, but no less horrifying. Aylin tried to focus on their structure to understand their biology, but the act of observing them sent waves of nausea through her. Their bodies seemed to contain no fixed geometry, constantly folding and unfolding into themselves, as if rejecting the limitations of three-dimensional space. The only consistent feature was their gaze, or rather, the feeling of being seen. It was as if the beings could peer through every layer of their existence, exposing them to truths they were not prepared to confront. Then one of the beings stepped forward, or perhaps it simply became closer. The vibrations intensified and the message repeated, this time accompanied by flashes of incomprehensible imagery. Vast fields of light and shadow, collapsing stars, and twisting loops of reality that seemed to defy causality. Aylin dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the message imprinted itself deeper into her mind. Time is not what you think. You are killing it. You are killing yourselves. By the time the encounter ended, the team was left shaken and irrevocably altered. The beings retreated into the rift, leaving behind a lingering hum that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The message was clear, but the solution was not. What did it mean to kill time? And if humanity had misunderstood its nature, could they hope to understand it in time to save themselves? As Aylin stared at the rift, a single chilling thought took root in her mind. The beings weren't here to save them. They were here to warn them, because whatever humanity had done to time, it was already fighting back. The research station in Antarctica was a fortress of steel and ice, perched on the edge of a continent that seemed timeless and alien in its own right. Inside, the air buzzed with the nervous energy of the assembled team as they began their investigation. The presence of the rift loomed over them, a constant reminder of the immense and incomprehensible force they were trying to study. Its pulse echoed faintly through the station walls, a rhythmic beat that seemed to sync with the trembling of their nerves. Dr. Aylin Kovac sat hunched over a terminal, her bloodshot eyes scanning streams of data collected from the rift. The instruments, the most advanced humanity had ever built, were struggling to make sense of the phenomenon. Readings contradicted each other, numbers fluctuating wildly as though the laws of physics were unraveling. The only consistency was the energy signature emanating from the rift, a strange, oscillating pattern that seemed to defy time itself, existing simultaneously in past, present, and future. These readings, Aylin muttered, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the station. It's not just a hole in space, it's something alive. It's interacting with us. Emily Vance, the team's philosopher, looked up from her notes. She had been trying to map the Pentarch's cryptic warnings against her theories on time. Alive? You mean sentient? Aylin shook her head, unsure. Not in the way we understand life, but it reacts, it adapts. Every time we measure it, it changes, like it's aware of us observing it. Dr. Imran Shafiq, the biologist, was pacing nearby, his hands clenching and unclenching. He hadn't slept in days, plagued by strange dreams of creatures he couldn't describe. If it's alive, it has to have some kind of structure, right? A system, cells, something we can analyze. Aylin hesitated. That's what I'm trying to figure out, but it's bigger than that. It's not just alive, it's temporal. Its existence is tied to time itself. It doesn't exist in the same way we do. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. If the rift was alive, if it was somehow connected to time, then humanity's understanding of the universe was even more flawed than they had feared. The Pentarch's warnings took on a new, chilling weight. As the days passed, the team's work grew more frantic. They analyzed ancient texts, long-forgotten theories on time, and even myths and folklore for any hint of an answer. They cross-referenced data from the rift with geological samples, historical records, and even the behavior of subatomic particles. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, but it was one that defied their comprehension. Time, they realized, was not a constant. It was not a linear thread that stretched endlessly forward, nor was it an abstract construct imposed by human minds. It was an organism, vast, ancient, and beyond anything they had imagined. It pulsed and shifted, its flows and eddies shaping the very fabric of reality. Humanity's perception of time as a rigid sequence of moments was a lie, a convenient illusion that allowed them to navigate their world without confronting the terrifying truth. Worse still, they discovered that humanity was not separate from time, but intrinsically tied to it. Every action, every decision, every thought sent ripples through the organism. For millennia, these ripples had been small, insignificant. But as humanity grew, its impact on time grew with it. Industrialization, war, the relentless push for progress, each step forward had disrupted the organism more and more, until now it was on the verge of collapse. Emily was the first to voice what they were all thinking. The Pentarchs weren't just warning us. They were telling us we're the disease. Imran slammed a hand down on the table, his voice rising with desperation. That doesn't make sense. How can we be a disease? We didn't choose this. We didn't even know time was alive. Does it matter? Aylin shot back, her own frustration boiling over. We're here. We exist. And every second we live, we're killing it. That's what they're trying to tell us. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the rift. It was Emily who finally spoke, her voice low and trembling. So what happens when it dies? No one had an answer, but deep down they all knew. If time collapsed, reality would follow. The past, present, and future would unravel, leaving nothing behind. Their worst fears were confirmed when Aylin analyzed a fresh batch of data from the rift. The energy signatures were accelerating, growing more erratic. The rift wasn't stable. It was expanding, devouring the surrounding space, and as it grew, it was pulling them in. Not physically, but temporally. Time within the station had begun to warp. Clocks spun wildly, their hands moving forward, then backward, then freezing altogether. Days seemed to pass in minutes, while moments stretched into hours. The team experienced vivid flashes of memories that didn't belong to them, glimpses of lives they had never lived. Imran was the first to notice the changes in their bodies. His fingertips tingled constantly, and when he looked closely, he saw the skin beneath his nails shifting, forming intricate fractal-like patterns. Aylin's headaches had worsened, accompanied by brief but terrifying episodes where she couldn't recognize her own reflection. Emily reported hearing voices, not hallucinations, but whispers in languages she didn't understand, like echoes from a timeline she wasn't supposed to inhabit. The more they studied the rift, the more it fought back. Instruments malfunctioned, data became corrupted, and their own minds began to betray them. Aylin started to suspect that their proximity to the rift was accelerating the process, drawing them deeper into its influence. But they couldn't stop. They were so close to understanding, so close to the truth. And then, finally, it all came together. Through a combination of data analysis, philosophical deduction, and sheer intuition, they realized what the rift truly was. Not a portal, not an invasion, but a wound. Humanity's relentless exploitation of time had torn the organism open, and the Pentarchs, if they could even be called that, were not invaders but immune cells. They had come to repair the damage, to heal the organism. But healing required sacrifice. Aylin stared at the data on her screen, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. "We're not just killing time," she whispered. "It's fighting back." The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if reality itself was hesitant to reveal its hand too quickly. At first, the team attributed the strange sensations and minor abnormalities to exhaustion and stress. Sleep deprivation, after all, could explain Aylin's splitting headaches and Emily's increasingly disjointed sense of time. But when Imran woke one morning with his fingertips translucent, veins and bone faintly visible beneath the thin membrane of his skin, they knew something was profoundly wrong. The Antarctic base had become a labyrinth of fear. The rift pulsed in the distance, its rhythm growing faster and louder, like a heartbeat spiraling into arrhythmia. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls of the station, often twisting in ways that defied the positioning of their sources. Sometimes they seemed to move independently, flickering just beyond the edge of vision. Every member of the team had started to feel the pull of something far beyond comprehension, an invisible force that burrowed deep into their bones, reshaping them from the inside out. Aylin's first transformation came when she was working at her terminal. She'd been running simulations on the rift's effects on local space-time when she felt her left arm seize up. The pain was sudden and white-hot, shooting through her shoulder and down to her fingertips. She gasped, clutching at the limb, and watched in horror as her forearm seemed to stretch, the bones elongating and twisting under her skin. Her fingers lengthened, their joints melting into a single fluid curve. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by a strange hum, low, rhythmic, and impossibly intimate, as though it was emanating from her own body. Emily and Imran rushed to her side, but by the time they reached her, the transformation had stopped. Aylin's arm was no longer recognizable. The skin shimmered faintly, as if infused with the same fractal patterns they had seen in the rift. Her fingers writhed slightly, independent of her will, and when she tried to speak, her voice cracked into a sound that wasn't entirely human. "It's in us," she finally managed to say, her breath shallow and panicked. "The rift, it's not just pulling us apart, it's rewriting us." Imran was next. The changes came slowly for him, spreading like a sickness. His eyes began to ache, a dull, persistent pressure that no medication could ease. Then, one morning, he woke up screaming. Emily found him in his bunk, clawing at his face as his eyes fused together into a single, bulging orb. The sclera turned a dark, iridescent black, and the iris shattered into countless smaller fragments, each reflecting light like a kaleidoscope. When Imran looked at them, it wasn't just a gaze. It was as if he could see through them, peering into layers of reality they couldn't comprehend. "I can see it," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling with both awe and terror. "The rift, it's everywhere. It's inside us. It's consuming us." Emily was the last to change, though hers was the most horrifying of all. She had been struggling with hallucinations for days, flashes of memories and voices that didn't belong to her. Sometimes she would wake up in different parts of the station, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. But it wasn't until her skin began to fracture that she realized the full extent of what was happening. Thin, jagged lines appeared along her arms and legs, running in perfect symmetry, like cracks in porcelain. At first, they were superficial, just discolorations beneath the surface, but soon they deepened, splitting her flesh into geometric segments. One night, as the rift's pulsing grew deafening, Emily's body began to move without her consent. She stood in the common area, her fractured limbs bending in impossible directions, the cracks widening to reveal a faint, pulsating light within. She spoke, but the voice wasn't her own. It was layered, echoing, as though coming from multiple versions of herself, speaking in unison. "The time organism rejects its parasite," she said, her glowing eyes fixed on Aelin and Imran. "You must choose, submit, or be consumed." The horror of their transformations was matched only by the unraveling of time within the station. Days no longer followed any logical sequence. They would wake to find entire sections of the base shifted or missing entirely. Clocks spun wildly, and the lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Aelin kept a journal to track their experiences, but even that became unreliable, the entries warping into incomprehensible symbols she didn't remember writing. The worst part was the awareness of the changes. They weren't simply mutating. They were being reshaped, reconfigured by the rift's influence. Their bodies were no longer entirely their own. Aelin could feel it in every fiber of her being, an alien presence threading through her veins and nerves, tugging her towards something vast and unknowable. Imran tried to resist, throwing himself into his work in a desperate bid to find a solution. But the more he studied the rift, the more it seemed to study him in return. He began to mutter to himself, speaking in languages he didn't know. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, his single eye staring blankly into the distance as though he were listening to something only he could hear. One night he approached Aelin, his movements slow and deliberate, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "It wants us to let go," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "It's not just about time. It's about existence. We're breaking it, and now it's breaking us." Aelin couldn't argue. Her own body was a constant reminder of their impending fate. Her elongated arm had lost all sensation, and her reflection in the cracked station mirror showed a face that no longer felt entirely her own. The transformations were accelerating, the rift's influence spreading like a cancer. Yet despite their fear, they couldn't stop. They were too close to understanding the truth, even if that truth meant their own annihilation. Each of them knew, deep down, that the only way forward was through the rift. It was no longer just a wound in time, it was a doorway. And whatever waited on the other side was the only thing that could save them, or destroy them entirely. The journey to the rift's core was a descent into madness. The station had become unrecognizable, its corridors twisting and collapsing in on themselves as though the very fabric of reality were folding into the rift's pulsating maw. Lights flickered erratically, casting angular shadows that shifted and writhed as if alive. The hum of the rift had grown deafening, vibrating through their bones and minds, a constant reminder that time was unraveling, and with it, their own existence. Aelin led the way, her mutated arm now a grotesque tendril, swaying with every step like an appendage from some deep-sea monstrosity. She no longer recoiled from it. There was no point. Her body was no longer her own, but it was still hers for now. Behind her, Imran stumbled, his single multifaceted eye scanning the distorted world around them. He had stopped speaking hours ago, if hours even still existed, but his breathing was shallow and labored, as if each step brought him closer to collapse. Emily was the last to follow, her fractured body glowing faintly in the dim light. The cracks in her skin had widened, and the pulsating light from within her now illuminated their path like a lantern. She moved with unnatural grace, her segmented limbs bending in ways that defied human anatomy. She no longer spoke in her own voice. When she did, it was layered, a cacophony of echoes from countless versions of herself across timelines she could barely comprehend. The rift loomed before them, a towering, writhing mass of light and shadow that defied all logic. It pulsed and shifted, its edges fracturing into geometric patterns that spiraled infinitely inward. The air around it was alive with static, an electric charge that raised every hair on their bodies. The closer they came, the more their thoughts began to fragment, memories bleeding into one another, identities unraveling like loose threads. They were no longer three individuals. They were fragments of a single shared moment, drawn together by the rift's inexorable pull. As they stood before it, the Pentarchs appeared once more, their forms more distinct, yet infinitely more terrifying. They were no longer shifting between shapes, but had solidified into grotesque amalgamations of light and flesh, their bodies pulsating with the rhythm of the rift. Their gaze, or what passed for it, fell upon the team, and the weight of their presence pressed down on them like the crushing depths of an ocean. One of the beings stepped forward, its voice resonating not in their ears, but directly in their minds. "You stand at the threshold. The organism that is time is dying. Your kind has pushed it to the brink. The wound must be healed, but healing requires sacrifice." Aylin's knees buckled under the weight of the message, her mind flooded with images. The collapse of timelines, the fragmentation of reality, the void that would consume everything if the rift was not closed. She saw humanity's relentless march forward, its obsession with progress, its disregard for the consequences. And she saw the organism of time itself, a vast, pulsating entity, its form incomprehensible, writhing in agony as it tried to hold itself together. "What sacrifice?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible over the rift's deafening hum. The Pentarch's reply was a single piercing thought that burned itself into their minds. One must merge with the organism, one must become its guide, a bridge, a voice, a guardian. You will cease to exist as you are, but your essence will remain, woven into the fabric of time itself. Aylin turned to her companions, her mutated arm twitching involuntarily. Imran was staring at the rift, his single eye reflecting its infinite spirals. Emily's glowing cracks pulsed in sync with the rift, her segmented body trembling as if on the verge of collapse. They had all known, on some level, that it would come to this. The Pentarchs had not come to save them. They had come to deliver an ultimatum, and there was no escaping it. "I'll go," Aylin said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging inside her. "I've already changed too much. I can feel it. The rift pulling me. It's already inside me." Imran turned to her, his grotesque eye glistening with tears. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "We're all dying, Imran. If I can stop this, if I can save what's left, then it has to be me." Imran turned to her, his grotesque eye glistening with tears. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "We're all dying, Imran. If I can stop this, if I can save what's left, then it has to be me." Emily stepped forward, her fractured form glowing brighter with each step. Her voice was an otherworldly chorus, both familiar and alien. "It won't just be you, Aylin. You won't be alone. We're all part of this now. Time isn't linear. It's a web, and we're the threads." Aylin nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She reached out her remaining human hand, and Emily and Imran took it, their warped bodies forming a grotesque, beautiful circle. For a brief moment they were whole again, not as individuals, but as fragments of a greater whole. The rift pulsed, its rhythm matching the beat of their hearts, and Aylin stepped forward. As she entered the rift, reality itself seemed to shatter. Light and darkness folded into each other, and Aylin felt her body dissolve, her physical form unraveling into pure energy. She was no longer Aylin Kovacs. She was a part of the organism of time, her consciousness expanding into something infinite and eternal. She could see everything. The birth of stars, the collapse of civilizations, the countless lives and choices that wove the tapestry of existence. And she understood. Time was not a thing to be controlled or conquered. It was a living, breathing entity, and humanity had nearly destroyed it. The rift began to close, its edges knitting together as Aylin's essence merged with the organism. The Pentarchs faded, their task complete, and the station fell silent. Emily and Imran stood alone in the stillness, their bodies still grotesque but no longer mutating. The rift was gone, but its mark remained, a faint, pulsating hum that seemed to echo in the distance, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. As they stared into the empty void where the rift had been, Emily spoke, her voice soft and distant. "She's still there, in the stars, in the moments. She's a part of it now." Imran nodded, his single eye reflecting the faint glow of the Antarctic horizon. "She saved us." And as they turned to leave, the faint hum grew louder, resonating not in the air but in their minds. A reminder that time was alive, and it would never forget the sacrifice made to save it.